February 14th, 2003, 6 a.m. A heavy steel wrecking ball swung through the morning fog, shattering the final concrete wall of Miami's oldest Pepsi-Cola bottling plant. There was no ceremony, no tearful goodbye from executives, just the violent crunch of metal against masonry, burying 50 years of labor under thousands of tons of debris. For half a century, this wasn't just a factory. It was the pulsing, sugar rush heart of South Florida. At its peak, its roaring conveyors pumped out millions of bottles a year, single-handedly fueling the neon-lit American dream of Miami. It provided stable, middle-class livelihoods for hundreds of local families who bled Pepsi Blue. But today, the roaring machines are gone. The loyal workers were handed severance envelopes and escorted off the premises. The ground where they poured their sweat was hastily paved over for a sterile commercial plaza, from a regional beverage empire to a forgotten parking lot in the blink of an eye. Why does a corporate juggernaut voluntarily obliterate its own physical legacy? How does a facility that survived the fiercest years of the Cola Wars suddenly become completely obsolete? It wasn't a sudden drop in soda sales, and it wasn't a local operational failure. The answer lies hidden in the cold, calculated spreadsheets of a boardroom hundreds of miles away. This is the story of the Pepsi Bottling Group's ruthless restructuring, and what happens when human loyalty collides with the unforgiving machinery of modern global capitalism. Post-World War II Miami was a city practically vibrating with raw, untamed energy. The swampy, quiet outpost of the early 20th century was rapidly transforming into a neon-drenched metropolis. As air conditioning transitioned from a rare luxury to a standard necessity, a tidal wave of new residents, tourists, and capital flooded into South Florida. The population was exploding, suburbs were sprawling relentlessly toward the edges of the Everglades, and the intense year-round subtropical heat created the ultimate high-stakes battleground for the beverage industry. In this sun-baked paradise, a cold soda was not merely a casual refreshment, it was a daily, physical necessity. But in the mid-20th century American South, the beverage market was not a free enterprise. It was a cultural dictatorship. Atlanta-born Coca-Cola held a near-mythical monopoly over the region. For generations, ordering a Coke was strictly synonymous with ordering a soda. Coca-Cola owned the local diners, the roadside gas stations, and the very cultural consciousness of the South. Breaking into this aggressively guarded market seemed like a logistical and financial impossibility for any competitor. Yet in the corporate boardrooms of Pepsi-Cola in New York, a bold counter-offensive was being meticulously planned. Pepsi was no longer content with being the budget brand of the Great Depression, the underdog drink that simply offered twice as much for a nickel. They wanted to be the beverage of the post-war youth, the liquid fuel of a new, modern America. And to conquer the South, they knew they couldn't just launch a marketing campaign. They needed a fortress deep behind enemy lines. Miami was chosen as the ultimate strategic beachhead. Unlike the deep-rooted traditional cities of the Old South, Miami was a transient city that looked entirely to the future. It was a place where brand loyalties could be rewritten. If Pepsi could capture the neon-lit heart of Florida, they could use it as a massive launchpad to fracture Coca-Cola's southern empire. However, shipping heavy glass bottles filled with liquid from out-of-state facilities was economically disastrous and strategically weak. To win a local war, Pepsi had to build a local arsenal. The decision was finalized to construct a state-of-the-art bottling facility right in the economic nerve center of Miami. This was not going to be a simple, hidden warehouse. It was designed from the ground up to be an industrial monument to Pepsi's ambition, a massive, gleaming complex of reinforced concrete, steel, and expansive glass that would loudly announce their permanent arrival in the region. Architects and structural engineers drafted blueprints for a sprawling facility that would incorporate the absolute latest in mid-century production technology. When the heavy machinery finally began arriving at the dusty construction site, it signaled a seismic shift in Miami's economic landscape, a city that had traditionally relied almost exclusively on tourism and real estate. Massive, gleaming stainless steel vats were carefully lowered into the syrup mixing rooms by heavy cranes. Industrial-grade glass washing machines, capable of boiling and sterilizing thousands of returned bottles an hour, were bolted deep into the concrete foundation. The bottling lines themselves were engineering marvels of the era. Intricate, fast-moving networks of conveyor belts, precision-filling nozzles, and capping mechanisms that operated like the internal clockwork of a giant metallic beast. The physical presence of the factory immediately began reshaping the surrounding community. In a city where employment was heavily seasonal and entirely dependent on the whims of the hospitality sector, the new Pepsi plant offered something incredibly rare, stable, blue-collar industrial careers. Hundreds of local men and women lined up around the block to secure positions on the factory floor, in the massive storage warehouses, and behind the wheels of the delivery fleets. Being hired meant a reliable, year-round paycheck, health benefits, and a concrete path to the American middle-class dream. For the workers clocking in for those early shifts, there was a palpable sense of pride. They were not just factory workers. They were the human engine of a rising empire. As the first glass bottles rolled off the roaring assembly line, the heavy, humid air inside the plant grew thick with the sweet scent of raw sugar syrup and the sharp, acidic bite of carbonation. The factory floor became a deafening symphony of industrial noise. The rhythmic clinking of glass against glass, the sharp hiss of pressurized air valves, and the deep, steady hum of the heavy conveyor motors. Every single bottle that passed through the bright quality control lights was a tiny carbonated soldier marching out to the front lines. But manufacturing the product was only half the battle. The real war was fought on the blistering hot asphalt of Dade County. The newly minted fleet of Pepsi Blue delivery trucks rolled out of the loading docks every morning long before sunrise, their drivers tasked with a grueling daily mission: to physically rip shelf space away from Coca-Cola. It was a street-level turf war. Delivery men had to aggressively negotiate with local bodega owners, independent grocery stores, and gas station managers to push Coke bottles aside and make room for the challenger. They successfully built their fortress, hired their local army, and established a formidable physical presence in the harshest battleground of the American beverage industry. The neon genesis of the Miami facility was a spectacular triumph of industrial ambition. However, creating this initial momentum was just the beginning. The population of Florida was continuing to explode at a terrifying rate, and the consumer demand for sugar and carbonation was about to reach unprecedented, feverish levels. To hold their hard-won ground and push their advantage, the plant would have to push its massive machinery and its loyal people to the absolute limit. By the late 1960s and extending through the explosive decades of the 1970s and 1980s, Miami had completely shed its skin as a sleepy winter retreat. It was rapidly cementing its status as a sprawling year-round international metropolis. The invention and widespread adoption of central air conditioning had fundamentally altered the demographics of the Sun Belt, while massive waves of immigration were reshaping the city's cultural and economic DNA. Millions of new residents poured into South Florida, bringing with them an insatiable, constant demand for cold refreshment. At the epicenter of this unprecedented consumer explosion stood the Miami Pepsi-Cola bottling plant, operating at a scale that its original architects could scarcely have imagined. This was the era of the Sugar Rush Empire, a golden age where the facility transitioned from a strategic regional beachhead into an undisputed industrial juggernaut. Inside the plant, the atmosphere was a masterclass in controlled chaos, a sensory overload of heat, noise, and perpetual motion. The production lines were no longer just running standard day shifts. They were roaring 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, effectively turning the building into a living, breathing entity that never slept. The sheer volume of liquid being processed was staggering. Thousands of gallons of highly concentrated, dark proprietary syrup arrived by rail and tanker, pumped into massive holding vats where it was perfectly calibrated with purified water and pressurized carbon dioxide. The factory floor vibrated continuously with the deafening, rhythmic clatter of the filler machines, which had been modified and pushed to their maximum rotational speeds. The heavy, humid Miami air inside the warehouse was permanently thick with the sticky, sweet scent of caramelized sugar and the sharp tang of escaping gas. Workers wore heavy ear protection as they navigated the slick, wet concrete floors, intensely monitoring the blindingly fast stream of glass bottles, and later, aluminum cans, that blurred past the intense quality control inspection lights. Getting the product into the bottle was only the first step. Moving it out into the sprawling city was a logistical mammoth task. The loading docks were a theater of non-stop, aggressive choreography. Forklifts zipped back and forth in a dangerous mechanical ballet, loading towering wooden pallets of freshly sealed soda straight from the production line onto waiting fleets of trucks. These delivery drivers were the frontline soldiers of the Cola Wars. They rolled out into the humid dawn, tasked with a grueling physical mission. Navigating the increasingly congested highways of Dade County, they manually lugged hundreds of pounds of liquid and glass into the backrooms of sprawling new supermarkets, neighborhood bodegas, and high-volume gas stations. In the punishing 90-degree subtropical heat, this was backbreaking labor, but it was a necessary battle for absolute market saturation. But the true lasting power of the Miami plant during its peak wasn't measured merely in gallons produced or revenue generated. It was measured in human capital. In a regional economy deeply skewed toward the volatile, seasonal, and low-paying hospitality and service sectors, a job at the Pepsi plant was an incredibly coveted prize. This facility was a reliable, formidable engine for the working class, producing not just soda, but a robust, local middle class. A position on the bottling line, in the distribution warehouse, or behind the wheel of a delivery route offered more than just a competitive wage. It offered comprehensive union-backed health benefits, a solid pension, and undeniable job security. For the men and women clocking in, the plant provided the financial foundation to buy a modest ranch home in emerging suburbs like Hialeah or Kendall, to purchase a reliable family car, and to send their children to college. It was a place where immense corporate loyalty was forged. It was common to see multiple generations of the same family working under the same roof. They proudly wore their uniforms, deeply identifying with the brand they were building with their own hands. They weren't just anonymous cogs in a corporate machine. They were a fiercely loyal community, a localized brotherhood united by the shared, grueling labor of feeding a booming city's thirst. Yet beneath the surface of this booming prosperity, the fundamental physics of industrial manufacturing were beginning to assert themselves. The relentless, punishing pace required to keep up with South Florida's exploding population came with a hidden, accumulating cost. Machinery of this scale was designed to operate with regular, scheduled downtime for thorough maintenance and part replacement. Instead, the Miami lines were being run redline, pushed to their absolute mechanical limits to meet ever-increasing quarterly production quotas mandated by corporate executives far removed from the realities of the factory floor. When a conveyor belt snapped or a high-speed filler valve jammed, the financial pressure to get the line moving again was immense and immediate. Maintenance crews were increasingly forced to perform rapid, temporary triage, patching problems with mechanical band-aids, rather than executing comprehensive overhauls. The plant was undeniably a massive cash cow for the corporation, but it was being milked aggressively, with diminishing regard for the long-term structural integrity of the equipment. Local management found themselves trapped in a dangerous, high-wire balancing act. They had to satisfy the local market's ravenous appetite while simultaneously keeping aging, overworked machinery from tearing itself apart. The golden era was producing record-breaking profits, but it was also systematically stripping the gears of the very engine that created them, quietly setting the stage for a mechanical and financial reckoning. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the physical reality of running a heavy industrial complex in a subtropical environment began to catch up with the Miami Pepsi plant. The facility had been running at a red-line pace for decades, maintaining a relentless operational tempo that left deep, irreversible scars on the infrastructure. The gleaming stainless steel that had once symbolized post-war American optimism was now heavily oxidized, fighting a daily, losing battle against South Florida's brutal cocktail of intense ultraviolet heat, high humidity, and coastal salt air. Rust, the silent and patient predator of the industrial age, began creeping into the very foundation of the building. It ate away at the edges of the heavy loading dock doors, corroded the massive structural beams that supported the syrup vats, and stained the concrete walls with long, weeping streaks of orange decay. The machinery inside, once the absolute pinnacle of mid-century engineering, was now dangerously obsolete. The high-speed rotary fillers, originally designed with the heavy, predictable weight of thick glass bottles in mind, were struggling violently to adapt to the modern era of lightweight aluminum cans and the increasingly popular, highly flexible PET plastic bottles. The precision timing gears were worn smooth from millions of rotations, bearings, exposed for years to caustic cleaning chemicals, and the highly acidic nature of spilled carbonated syrup, frequently seized up, sending horrifying metallic screeches echoing across the factory floor. The physical environment became increasingly oppressive. The aging industrial ventilation systems could no longer expel the tremendous, suffocating heat generated by the overworked electric motors and the boiling bottle sterilization units. The warehouse turned into a sweltering, sticky cavern where the air felt heavy enough to drown in. The floors were permanently slick with a mixture of condensation, machine oil, and sugary residue, creating a hazardous landscape for the workers navigating the tight spaces between the roaring conveyors. For the veteran maintenance crews, every single shift devolved into an exercise in desperate, high-stakes triage. They were no longer properly maintaining a factory, they were keeping a mechanical zombie alive. When a heavy conveyor belt snapped under the strain or a primary bottling line jammed, they rarely had the luxury of ordering new, modernized replacement parts. The factory floor became a chaotic patchwork of temporary fixes that had slowly, tragically, become permanent. Maintenance workers fabricated makeshift solutions, sometimes cannibalizing retired machines to keep the primary lines limping forward through the end of the day. The workers on the floor felt a profound, heavy shift in the atmosphere. The chest-swelling pride of the early decades was steadily being replaced by a grueling, cynical exhaustion. They were being explicitly ordered to hit aggressive, modern 1990s production targets using fatigued, mid-century equipment. But as difficult as the physical labor had become, the real threat to their livelihoods wasn't just the rust accumulating on the machinery. It was a fundamental, invisible shift in how the beverage industry viewed the geography of manufacturing. While the blue-collar workers inside the Miami plant were fighting a localized, sweaty war against failing gears and suffocating heat, a much larger, colder war was being waged in corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away. The entire paradigm of American manufacturing was undergoing a brutal, unfeeling evolution. The traditional mid-century model, building localized plants directly in the heart of urban centers to be physically close to the consumer was rapidly becoming a massive financial liability. Miami's real estate market was exploding in value. The sprawling acreage the factory sat on, now completely surrounded by an increasingly dense, modernized urban grid, was becoming vastly more valuable than the aging industrial operation it housed. Furthermore, operating heavy, diesel-guzzling delivery trucks in the suffocating gridlock of modern Dade County was driving distribution costs through the roof. The logistical advantage of being in the city center had mutated into an inescapable logistical nightmare. Simultaneously, a new apex predator emerged on the industrial horizon, the mega facility. Corporate executives at Pepsi's headquarters realized that by completely consolidating operations into massive, hyper-automated plants situated in cheaper, rural, or suburban areas across state lines, such as Central Florida or Georgia, they could drastically slash their overhead. These new mega facilities were pristine, climate-controlled marvels of modern engineering, run by computerized logistics systems and robotic palletizers that required only a fraction of the human workforce. They were deliberately built on cheap land, comfortably far from the high property taxes, unionized labor demands, and daily traffic gridlocks of a major coastal metropolis. Against these sterile, highly efficient corporate titans, the aging Miami plant simply did not stand a chance. On the executive spreadsheets, the South Florida facility was no longer viewed as a proud regional fortress or a community pillar. It was a glaring red line of inefficiency. The cost per case of soda produced in Miami was steadily climbing due to mechanical failures and urban logistics, while the cost at the new out-of-state mega facilities was plummeting. The tension between the factory floor and top-level management grew incredibly toxic. Budgets for essential maintenance, safety upgrades, and infrastructure repair in Miami were quietly but ruthlessly slashed. The corporate parent was essentially starving the plant of capital, demanding maximum physical output, while explicitly refusing to invest a single dollar into the facility's long-term survival. The workers, many of whom had given 2 or 3 decades of their lives to the company, found themselves trapped in an impossible, heartbreaking paradox. They were working harder, in increasingly dangerous and degraded conditions, desperately trying to prove their worth and generate profits for a corporate entity that had already calculated the exact financial value of their obsolescence. The rust on the factory machines was merely a physical symptom. The real decay was in the boardroom's commitment to the people who had built their empire from the ground up. As the late 20th century unfolded, the rivalry between Pepsi and Coca-Cola escalated from a fierce regional battle into one of the most expensive and culturally pervasive corporate conflicts in global history. This was the defining era of the Cola Wars, a period characterized by billion-dollar marketing budgets, aggressive market share tactics, and high-profile celebrity endorsements. On television screens across America and around the world, the Pepsi brand was meticulously projecting an image of flawless, futuristic youth. They were the self-proclaimed choice of a new generation, a corporate behemoth that aggressively aligned itself with the absolute biggest icons of pop culture. Hundreds of millions of dollars were enthusiastically poured into securing exclusive multi-year contracts with global superstars like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Cindy Crawford. Super Bowl halftime shows and primetime commercial breaks were completely dominated by slick, high-production advertisements that often cost more to film than the annual operating budgets of some small municipalities. From the outside looking in, Pepsi was a modern juggernaut practically printing money. The corporate balance sheets were consistently reporting record-breaking profits quarter after quarter. Wall Street analysts celebrated the aggressive, flashy marketing strategies, rewarding top executives with massive performance bonuses and continuously climbing stock valuations. The public perception was one of an unstoppable, hyper-modern empire entirely insulated from financial struggle or physical limitations. However, there was a profound and deeply unsettling dissonance between the glamorous, flawless image broadcast on television and the gritty, exhausting reality unfolding on the floor of the Miami bottling plant. While corporate executives in high-rise corner offices approved astronomical advertising budgets with a casual stroke of a pen, the local management in South Florida was fighting a humiliating daily battle just to secure basic funding for essential mechanical upgrades. The millions of dollars flowing seamlessly out to pop stars and Madison Avenue advertising agencies were fundamentally subsidized by a quiet, ruthless starvation of the company's own physical infrastructure. The Miami plant, despite being a critical artery for the highly lucrative South Florida consumer market, had essentially been reclassified on the corporate ledger. It was no longer viewed as a long-term asset deserving of continuous structural reinvestment. Instead, it was treated as a depreciating workhorse, expected to yield maximum physical output with absolutely minimal financial input. For the men and women clocking into the humid, deafening factory floor in Dade County, the daily reality was a stark, brutal contrast to the polished commercials they saw in their living rooms. They watched as the brand they physically manufactured spent unimaginable sums of money to project a pristine image, while they were simultaneously ordered to hit aggressive new production targets using equipment that was literally rusting beneath their hands. The workforce, deeply loyal and highly skilled, found themselves caught in an infuriating paradox. They were the physical engine driving the localized profits that helped fund the global cola wars, yet they were entirely excluded from the spoils of that victory. When a critical piece of machinery, like an aging robotic palletizer, a primary carbonation manifold, or a heavy-duty forklift, would inevitably fail due to sheer operational exhaustion, the requested funds for replacement parts were routinely denied or endlessly delayed by corporate finance departments. The instruction from above was always the same: make do with what you have. This forced the Miami maintenance crews into a dangerous, high-stress game of mechanical improvisation. They scavenged parts from decommissioned lines, welded together fractured steel joints that should have been entirely replaced, and bypassed failing safety sensors just to keep the high-speed belts moving. The factory floor, once a source of immense working-class pride, was rapidly transforming into a stressful, hazardous environment. The sheer physical toll of maintaining this illusion of corporate invincibility was being extracted directly from the sweat, muscle, and nervous systems of the blue-collar workforce. The psychological and physical impact of this corporate starvation strategy was profound, hollowing out the spirit of the Miami facility from the inside out. For decades, the implicit social contract at the plant had been built on a foundation of mutual loyalty. The workers gave their bodies, their time, and their meticulous attention to the production line, and in exchange, the company provided security, respect, and a stable, dignified path to the American middle class. But the brutal financial logic of the cola wars fundamentally rewrote that contract. In the relentless pursuit of quarter-over-quarter growth to satisfy Wall Street analysts and fund endless marketing campaigns, the human element of the manufacturing process was systematically demoted. The loyal workforce was no longer seen by top executives as a community of stakeholders or a competitive advantage. On the corporate ledgers, they were simply categorized as variable labor costs, a number that needed to be constantly minimized, squeezed, and optimized to offset the massive expenditures happening elsewhere in the global empire. This shift in corporate philosophy manifested in incredibly harsh working conditions. To meet the ever-increasing demands of the booming Miami market, without the benefit of modernized, efficient machinery, the plant was forced to rely entirely on the sheer physical endurance of its workers. Mandatory overtime became the rule rather than the exception. Standard shifts stretched into grueling 12 and sometimes 16-hour marathons. The physical exhaustion was compounding daily. Workers were operating high-speed, heavy industrial equipment while fighting severe sleep deprivation and heat exhaustion. A dangerous combination that inevitably led to an increase in localized accidents, repetitive stress injuries, and near misses on the factory floor. The concept of blood on the balance sheet was no longer merely a financial metaphor for budget cuts. It was becoming a grim physical reality for the men and women forced to navigate a degrading, unsafe environment just to keep their jobs. The tension on the factory floor reached a quiet, simmering boiling point. The seasoned operators, many of whom had spent 20 or 30 years mastering the specific quirks of their individual machines, felt a deep, localized sense of betrayal. They knew exactly how much revenue their specific production lines were generating for the company every single shift. They saw the loaded delivery trucks leaving the facility hour after hour, bound for every major supermarket, theme park, and gas station from West Palm Beach down to the Florida Keys. They were fully aware that they were generating massive, tangible wealth, but they were being treated as entirely expendable liabilities. The localized management, caught in the crossfire between the impossible, unrelenting demands of corporate headquarters and the crumbling physical reality of the factory floor, often bore the brunt of this rising anger. However, the local managers were equally powerless. They were simply middlemen, enforcing edicts handed down from executives who had likely never set foot inside the humid, deafening walls of the Miami facility. The disconnect between the boardroom and the factory floor had become absolute. The decision-makers viewed the business entirely through the abstract, sterile lens of financial metrics, completely divorced from the physical, mechanical, and human realities required to actually manufacture the product. By the late 1990s, this unsustainable dynamic had permanently fractured the morale of the Miami plant. The immense corporate loyalty that had once been the defining characteristic of the workforce was replaced by a grim, defensive cynicism. The workers realized with heartbreaking clarity that they were fighting a grueling daily war for an empire that had already abandoned them. They were holding the line, pushing aging machinery to its absolute breaking point, completely unaware that the corporate strategists had already deemed their entire facility obsolete. The millions spent on Super Bowl commercials were not just a display of corporate dominance. They were a glaring, daily reminder that the company possessed infinite resources, but simply chose to deploy none of them toward the people actually doing the heavy lifting. The stage was tragically set for a massive corporate restructuring, one that would prioritize global efficiency over localized loyalty, and finally bring the hammer down on the Miami operation. In the spring of 1999, Besquicho crescente Maine, a massive tectonic shift occurred in the corporate architecture of the beverage world, one that would quietly and irrevocably seal the fate of the Miami facility. PepsiCo, seeking to rapidly accelerate its stock value and streamline its global operations, executed one of the largest initial public offerings in corporate history. They strategically spun off their massive, capital-intensive manufacturing and distribution network into an entirely new, independent, publicly traded entity, the Pepsi Bottling Group, or PBG. This was not merely a change in corporate letterhead. It was a fundamental, aggressive rewiring of the entire business philosophy. For decades, the parent company had absorbed the heavy financial costs of physical manufacturing, balancing the expensive, gritty reality of operating bottling lines against the highly lucrative, high-margin business of selling concentrated syrup and intellectual property. But Wall Street demanded higher, faster returns. The modern solution was to separate the glamorous brand from the heavy machinery. PepsiCo would retain the highly profitable marketing, brand management, and syrup production, while the newly formed PBG would be tasked entirely with the grueling, low-margin, capital-intensive reality of putting the liquid into bottles and physically driving it to supermarkets. Overnight, PBG became the world's largest manufacturer, seller, and distributor of Pepsi-Cola beverages. However, as a newly independent company answering directly to its own aggressive base of shareholders, PBG was born with a ruthless, singular mandate: optimize the global supply chain, eliminate all operational redundancies, and maximize asset utilization at all absolute costs. The era of the regional, community-based bottling fortress was officially dead. It was swiftly replaced by a sterile, hyper-analytical culture of extreme corporate consolidation. PBG's executive leadership, operating out of sleek, quiet headquarters in New York, immediately launched a comprehensive microscopic audit of their newly inherited physical empire. They deployed specialized teams of logistics experts, supply chain analysts, and efficiency consultants to evaluate every single bottling plant in North America. These auditors were not interested in local history, generational employee loyalty, or community economic impact. They evaluated facilities using a cold, unyielding matrix of financial metrics: cost per case, total throughput capacity, real estate valuation, and geographical redundancy. When this uncompromising analytical lens was finally turned toward the Miami operation, the results were devastatingly clear. The South Florida plant, despite its historical significance and the heroic, agonizing efforts of its exhausted workforce, scored terribly on the new corporate matrix. The facility was geographically landlocked by decades of expensive urban development, making physical expansion or modernization virtually impossible. Its mid-century infrastructure was a massive financial liability that would require tens of millions of dollars in capital expenditure simply to bring it up to PBG's modern safety and efficiency standards. Furthermore, the suffocating, perpetual traffic gridlock of modern Miami severely penalized the logistics of distributing heavy liquid product from the city center. When the corporate auditors physically arrived in Miami, their presence sent a chilling, undeniable ripple across the factory floor. The men and women who had spent decades wrestling with aging machinery suddenly found themselves shadowed by analysts carrying clipboards and stopwatches. Every movement was timed. Every mechanical breakdown was documented and monetized. The workers, already pushed to the brink of physical exhaustion by mandatory overtime and a lack of proper maintenance funding, attempted to put on a brave face. They ran the rusted lines as hard as the fatigued gears would allow, desperate to prove their ongoing value to the new PBG overlords. But it was a fundamentally unwinnable battle. They were fighting a war of muscle and sweat against opponents armed with algorithms and depreciation schedules. The auditors looked at the sprawling, noisy, humid factory and did not see the human engine that had built the local market. They saw only deferred maintenance, high property taxes, and an unacceptable cost-per-case ratio. The plant was being clinically reduced to a negative variable in a global financial equation. The actual tipping point arrived not with a dramatic, catastrophic failure of machinery on the floor, but with a quiet, closed-door boardroom presentation hundreds of miles away. By the early 2000s, PBG's executive committee had reviewed the comprehensive audits and finalized their national restructuring blueprint. The strategy was clear, brutal, and entirely logical from a purely financial perspective. Liquidate the inefficient, aging urban facilities and consolidate massive production volume into automated regional mega-hubs. The Miami plant, after nearly half a century of uninterrupted operation, was officially designated on corporate ledgers as a surplus asset. The decision was a masterclass in modern corporate detachment. The executives who signed the closure authorization did not harbor any specific malice toward the hundreds of workers in South Florida. They simply did not factor them into the equation at all. The human cost of the closure, the lost pensions, the shattered livelihoods. The sudden displacement of a deeply rooted blue-collar community was thoroughly externalized. It was treated merely as a brief, unavoidable friction cost on the path to optimize shareholder returns. The logistics of the shutdown were planned with the same cold, military precision that PBG applied to its supply chain. The plan was not to phase out the plant slowly, which could risk a drop in worker morale and a subsequent, unacceptable dip in production quality. Instead, the strategy was to keep the Miami facility running at maximum capacity right up until the very last possible moment, extracting every final drop of profitability before pulling the plug completely. However, in an environment so tightly wound, secrets are impossible to keep. Rumors inevitably began to bleed through the corporate firewall, filtering down to the factory floor. Delivery drivers heard whispers from regional managers. Veteran maintenance workers noticed that purchase orders for even the most basic replacement parts were suddenly being outright canceled rather than just delayed. A heavy, suffocating atmosphere of impending doom settled over the plant. The deafening roar of the bottling lines, which had once been the reassuring, constant sound of job security and economic progress, now sounded exactly like a countdown clock. The final months of operation were a surreal, one psychologically agonizing period for the workforce. They were forced to continue showing up for grueling 12-hour shifts, meticulously maintaining the very machines that they knew were destined for the scrap heap, bottling soda for a corporate entity that was actively organizing their unemployment. The psychological toll was devastating. Decades of fierce corporate loyalty were instantly dissolved into a bitter, helpless resentment. Men and women who had dedicated their entire adult lives to the brand, who had worn the company logo with genuine pride, found themselves confronting a terrifying void. They were aging industrial workers in a city that had aggressively transitioned into a post-industrial, service-based economy. There was no safety net, no comparable manufacturing jobs waiting for them in the gleaming, tourist-driven landscape of modern Miami. The ultimate heartbreaking betrayal was the realization of exactly how easily they could be replaced, not by a superior workforce, but by a completely different logistical geography. The product would still flow seamlessly into South Florida. The supermarket shelves would still be fully stocked with exactly the same brightly colored cans and plastic bottles. But that product would now be silently trucked down the interstate from highly automated facilities located in cheaper, non-unionized counties, completely bypassing the human community that had spent 50 years building the market. The massive corporate machine had simply rerouted its circulatory system, isolating the Miami plant like a dying limb. The death sentence had been handed down, the corporate appeals were non-existent, and all that remained was the grim, mechanical reality of the final execution. By the late summer of 2002, the atmosphere inside the Miami Pepsi-Cola bottling plant had mutated into something entirely surreal and profoundly suffocating. The official closure authorization had been quietly signed, sealed, and delivered by the PBG Executive Committee in New York. The execution date was set, yet because the newly built regional mega-hubs were not fully online and ready to absorb the immense volume of the South Florida market, the Miami facility was ordered to keep running at absolute maximum capacity. The sprawling industrial complex had essentially been placed on corporate death row, but the condemned machine was still expected to sprint right up until the moment the trapdoor opened. For the hundreds of men and women who clocked in every morning, the final weeks of operation were an exercise in psychological torture. They were actively participating in the systematic dismantling of their own livelihoods. Every massive wooden pallet of soda they loaded onto the outgoing delivery trucks felt like a step closer to their own unemployment. The intense 90-degree Miami heat inside the aging warehouse felt heavier than usual, thick with an unspoken, collective grief. The most agonizing paradox of these final months fell squarely on the shoulders of the veteran maintenance crews. These mechanics and engineers had spent 2, sometimes 3 decades learning the intimate mechanical language of the factory. They knew exactly which conveyor belt required a specific tension adjustment, which high-speed filler valve tended to stick in high humidity, and how to coax maximum efficiency out of motors that should have been retired during the Reagan administration. Now, they were ordered to maintain that exact standard of excellence for a corporation that was throwing them away. The cruelty of the mandate was undeniable. Keep the rusting, fatigued machinery running perfectly so that the company wouldn't lose a single dollar of revenue during the transition to the automated mega facilities that were replacing them. Despite the overwhelming sense of betrayal, a stubborn, localized pride took hold on the factory floor. The workers made a quiet, collective decision that they would not let the plant fail on their watch. If the executives in New York wanted the Miami facility dead, they would have to kill a machine that was still fighting. The blue-collar operators pushed through the grueling, mandatory overtime shifts with a grim, mechanical determination. They fabricated last-minute replacement parts, welded failing joints, and navigated the slick, sugary floors with the precision of seasoned soldiers fighting a losing war. As the calendar pages turned and the final day rapidly approached, the sprawling building began to physically empty out around them. Unnecessary inventory was aggressively liquidated. Sections of the warehouse that had once been stacked to the ceiling with raw materials were cleared out, leaving massive, echoing voids of empty concrete. The sounds of the factory began to change. The overlapping, deafening roar of multiple production lines was slowly reduced as peripheral machinery was decommissioned early. The remaining active bottling lines seemed to echo louder in the cavernous, emptying space, a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat that everyone knew was about to flatline. When the morning of the final shift finally arrived, it began long before the brutal Miami sun breached the horizon. The workers pulled into the sprawling asphalt parking lot, just as they had done thousands of times before. But there was no casual banter in the locker rooms. There was no optimistic talk about the weekend or upcoming vacations. Men and women who had spent their entire adult lives wearing the Pepsi blue uniform laced up their heavy steel-toed boots in a heavy, funereal silence. They walked out onto the factory floor, taking their familiar positions beside the conveyor belts, staring down the barrel of an 8-hour shift that would ultimately erase their community from the map. The actual final hours of operation were not marked by any grand ceremonies, corporate speeches, or tearful visits from upper management. The executive leadership who had engineered the closure from their climate-controlled boardrooms were noticeably absent, choosing to remain safely insulated from the gritty, emotional reality of the execution they had ordered. On the factory floor, the end arrived with the cold, unfeeling precision of an industrial timetable. The high-speed lines ran their final batches of the morning. The workers watched intensely as the last thousands of plastic bottles and aluminum cans rattled down the stainless steel tracks, spinning under the capping machines, and passing through the blinding white inspection lights for the very last time. For half a century, this uninterrupted stream of product had been the physical manifestation of the American dream for the local workforce. Now they were simply watching it drain away. As the final pallet was shrink-wrapped and loaded onto the waiting forklift, the order was given to begin the shutdown sequence. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing decrescendo. First, the massive, vibrating syrup mixers were powered down, their heavy internal blades grinding to a halt. Then, the high-pressure carbonation manifolds were bled out, releasing a long, sharp hiss of pressurized air that sounded unsettlingly like a deep sigh. Finally, the heavy electrical breakers for the primary conveyor networks were pulled. The rhythmic, deafening clatter of glass and aluminum that had been the acoustic backdrop of these workers' lives for decades suddenly ceased. The silence that rushed in to fill the massive warehouse was unnatural, heavy, and absolutely devastating. For the first time in 50 years, the Miami plant was completely still. Without the massive ventilation fans and the roaring motors, the sheer physical size of the building became overwhelming. The air immediately grew stagnant and oppressively hot. With the machinery dead, the transition from an industrial powerhouse to an HR processing center was shockingly swift. The workforce was instructed to gather in the cleared-out sections of the warehouse. Folding tables had been hastily set up on the stained concrete floor, manned by external human resources representatives carrying thick stacks of manila envelopes. There was no dignity in the final transaction. Workers lined up to hand over their ID badges, their keys, and the physical access to the only professional life many of them had ever known. In return, they were handed a severance package, a neatly calculated stack of paper that assigned a definitive, terminal financial value to 20 or 30 years of unshakable loyalty. Grown men, veterans of the Cola Wars, who had sacrificed their knees, their hearing, and their youth to keep the high-speed lines running, stood in the sweltering heat with tears streaming down their faces. They embraced their mechanics, their forklift drivers, and their line managers. They were not just losing a paycheck. They were watching the forced dissolution of a tight-knit family. The localized brotherhood that had been forged in the extreme heat and pressure of the bottling plant was being permanently scattered into the wind by a corporate spreadsheet. As the workers walked out of the heavy warehouse doors and into the blinding midday Florida sun for the last time, many stopped in the parking lot to look back. The massive concrete facade of the building, stained with rust and decades of industrial exhaust, stood silent against the bright blue sky. It had survived hurricanes, economic recessions, and the fiercest years of global corporate warfare, but it could not survive the ruthless, optimizing algorithms of modern capitalism. By the time the last car drove out of the lot and the heavy iron perimeter gates were padlocked shut by private security, the transformation was complete. The pulsing, sugar rush artery of South Florida had been cleanly severed. The workers drove away into a modernizing city that no longer had a place for them, leaving behind a silent, monumental ghost of mid-century industry that was already slated for the wrecking ball. In the immediate aftermath of the final shift, the sprawling Miami Pepsi-Cola facility did not become a romanticized, decaying monument to American industry. There was no prolonged period of quiet abandonment where subtropical nature slowly reclaimed the concrete, nor did the building become a canvas for local street artists or a haven for urban explorers. The Pepsi Bottling Group, having already calculated the immense financial value of the underlying real estate, moved with the same ruthless, optimizing speed that had dictated the factory's closure. The land, sitting directly in the heart of a rapidly booming, increasingly dense Miami, was worth exponentially more than the rusted mid-century infrastructure sitting on top of it. Within weeks of the final employee handing over their ID badge and collecting their severance, the heavy machinery returned to the site. However, these were not the familiar delivery trucks or the massive syrup tankers of the golden era. These were the bulldozers, the heavy excavators, and the wrecking balls of commercial demolition. The corporate execution was absolute, and the physical erasure of the plant was carried out with staggering, unsentimental efficiency. The towering stainless steel syrup vats, which had once held the sweet lifeblood of the operation, were rapidly drained, unbolted, and unceremoniously sold off to the highest bidder for scrap metal. The intricate, high-speed bottling lines that veteran mechanics had spent decades desperately patching together were violently torn apart, their rusted gears and specialized conveyor belts tossed into massive industrial dumpsters. The demolition crews systematically stripped the building of its mechanical soul before turning their attention to the reinforced concrete shell. When the heavy wrecking balls finally struck the outer walls, they did not just shatter masonry, they pulverized 50 years of localized working-class history. The deafening crashes of crumbling concrete echoed across the exact same asphalt where thousands of delivery drivers had once loaded their trucks in the humid pre-dawn hours. The heavy, relentless Florida rain eventually washed away the deep, sticky stains of caramelized sugar and machine oil that had seeped deep into the loading docks over half a century of continuous operation. This rapid physical obliteration was a stark testament to the unyielding velocity of modern urbanization. Miami, a transient city permanently fixated on its own glittering future and aggressive real estate expansion, possesses notoriously little patience for industrial nostalgia. There was no public outcry to save the building, no historical preservation society rushing in at the 11th hour to declare the mid-century factory a landmark of local labor. The broader metropolis simply did not care that a massive economic engine had just been abruptly extinguished. The relentless march of capital required a blank slate, and the corporation was more than happy to provide one in exchange for a massive real estate payout. The sheer scale and speed of the erasure was psychologically jarring for the displaced workforce. Men and women who had spent 20 or 30 years navigating the intricate labyrinth of the factory floor, who knew the exact acoustic rhythm of every machine and the precise temperature of every warehouse zone, would occasionally drive past the site out of a morbid, lingering curiosity. Instead of their familiar industrial fortress, they found a rapidly flattening expanse of crushed gravel and twisted rebar. The exact physical coordinates where they had met their spouses, formed lifelong friendships, and earned the money to buy their family homes, were being permanently deleted from the urban grid. It was as if their decades of grueling labor, their sacrificed bodies, and their fierce corporate loyalty had simply never existed. The transition of the property perfectly mirrored the broader macroeconomic shift of the American economy at the dawn of the 21st century. The site transitioned violently from a place of heavy, tangible production to a space of lightweight, service-oriented consumption, where unionized mechanics once earned a robust middle-class wage maintaining complex machinery. Minimum wage retail workers would soon stand behind cash registers. The economic anchor of the community had been replaced by a superficial facade of commercial real estate. The wealth generated on this specific plot of land no longer circulated deeply within the local working-class neighborhoods. Instead, it was immediately siphoned upward to corporate shareholders and distant property investment trusts. In a matter of months, the prime real estate was smoothed over, freshly paved, and seamlessly integrated back into the modern commercial landscape of South Florida. A sterile, highly optimized retail plaza and expansive parking lots rose over the exact spot where the roaring bottling lines had once fueled a regional empire. There was no commemorative bronze plaque placed on a wall, no public acknowledgement of the hundreds of families who had built their lives on that very soil. The new architecture of the site was deliberately amnesiac, designed exclusively for transient consumerism rather than community anchoring. Shoppers now park their SUVs and walk across the gleaming asphalt, completely unaware that they are treading directly over the ghosts of a forgotten industrial powerhouse. They do not know that just beneath the newly planted decorative palm trees lie the crushed foundations of a facility that survived the fiercest years of the Cola Wars. The corporate strategy was flawlessly executed. The production was successfully outsourced to cheaper mega hubs. The liability of the aging urban plant was liquidated, and the balance sheets were perfectly optimized. But the localized trauma left in the wake of this concrete erasure would quietly echo through the surrounding neighborhoods, long after the dust of the demolition had finally settled. The physical footprint of the Miami Pepsi-Cola plant was easily erased by bulldozers and paving machines, but the economic and psychological shockwaves of its closure rippled through the surrounding working-class neighborhoods for years to come. The demise of this specific facility was not an isolated local tragedy. Rather, it served as a perfect, crystalline microcosm of a massive paradigm shift in global capitalism. For the better part of the 20th century, the American industrial social contract was built on a foundation of reciprocal investment. Corporations needed deep, physical roots in a community to manufacture their products, and in exchange, they provided stable, dignified livelihoods that anchored the middle class. But the Pepsi Bottling Group's ruthless restructuring signaled the definitive, unapologetic end of that era. In the new corporate architecture, localized loyalty was no longer an asset. It was considered a nostalgic, expensive liability. Human beings, with their pensions, healthcare requirements, union contracts, and aging physical bodies, had been entirely abstracted. They were no longer viewed as the vital, beating heart of production. Instead, they had been reduced to mere data points, variable labor costs meticulously organized and easily deleted within the sterile cells of a corporate Excel spreadsheet. For the hundreds of blue-collar workers who were handed their severance envelopes and escorted off the property in 2002, the transition into the modern Miami economy was exceptionally brutal. They were a highly skilled, fiercely loyal industrial army that had suddenly been discharged into a city that no longer fought that kind of war. South Florida in the early 2000s was aggressively leaning into its identity as a glittering, service-oriented playground for international wealth. The region was booming with luxury real estate development, high-end hospitality, and sprawling retail complexes. However, none of these booming economic sectors required the specific, heavy-duty mechanical expertise of a veteran bottling line operator, a high-speed conveyor technician, or a master syrup mixer. Men and women who had spent decades meticulously securing their place in the middle class found themselves terrifyingly slipping backward. The few manufacturing or warehouse jobs that remained in the immediate area paid a fraction of their former wages, offering absolutely nothing in the way of comprehensive benefits, retirement pensions, or long-term job security. Many former Pepsi workers were forced to swallow their pride and take on multiple part-time roles in the gig economy or the lower tiers of the service sector. They found themselves driving delivery vans as independent contractors without health care, working graveyard maintenance shifts at massive tourist resorts, or scanning items at the very retail plazas that were actively being built over the crushed foundations of their former factory. The deep, localized brotherhood that had been forged in the sweltering heat of the bottling plant was permanently shattered. They were isolated, scattered across the sprawling, traffic-choked metropolis, forced to individually navigate an economy that fundamentally did not value their history, their loyalty, or their specialized mechanical skills. Meanwhile, the ruthless corporate strategy that had mandated their sacrifice functioned exactly as designed. The massive, hyper-automated mega-facilities located in cheaper, non-unionized counties in Central Florida and Georgia smoothly absorbed the production volume. Giant fleets of 18-wheelers now silently truck the exact same brightly colored cans and plastic bottles down the interstate, flooding the Miami market with absolute mathematical precision. The consumer never noticed a single day of disruption. The soda on the supermarket shelf tastes exactly the same, is chilled to the exact same temperature, and offers the exact same momentary rush of sugar and carbonation. But the hidden, uncalculated cost of that seamless delivery is the total severance of the product from the community that consumes it. The modern beverage industry has achieved absolute logistical perfection by completely sanitizing the human element from the equation. The story of the Miami Pepsi plant is not a traditional story of a business that failed because people stopped buying its product. It is a much colder, more unsettling tale of a highly successful, globally dominant business that simply decided it no longer needed its people. It is a testament to an era where corporate efficiency completely divorced itself from civic responsibility. The rusted gears, the deafening roar of the assembly line, and the sweaty, communal pride of the factory floor have been permanently replaced by the quiet, unyielding hum of digital supply chains and offshore shareholder dividends. If you stand today in the sprawling, generic parking lot that now occupies that prime Miami real estate, beneath the bright, unforgiving Florida sun and the swaying decorative palm trees, you will find no physical trace of the empire that once stood there. But for the families who gave their youth to those roaring machines, the echoes remain. It is the lingering sound of a time when the American dream was built by hand, bottle by bottle, sweat by sweat, before it was permanently outsourced, relentlessly optimized, and quietly paved over. The story of the Miami Pepsi-Cola plant is more than just a forgotten footnote in the sprawling history of the Cola Wars. It is a profound, cautionary tale about the true, hidden cost of modern corporate efficiency. We now live in an era of seamless, frictionless consumption. The products we buy arrive on pristine supermarket shelves with absolute mathematical precision, completely divorced from the heavy, sweaty, mechanical reality required to create them. When we look at a modern, hyper-automated supply chain, we see logistical perfection, but what we often fail to see is exactly what had to be erased to achieve it. For half a century, the Miami bottling plant represented a now extinct version of American capitalism, a system where a corporation and a local community were fundamentally, physically bound together. The blue-collar workers gave the company their physical endurance, their deep localized knowledge, and their unwavering loyalty. In return, the corporate entity provided the solid economic foundation required to build a stable middle-class life. It was a gritty, imperfect transaction, but it was built on mutual necessity. But the brutal restructuring of the late 90s and the relentless, modern pursuit of maximized shareholder value fractured that foundation forever. The tragedy of the Miami facility wasn't that its mid-century machinery eventually succumbed to rust and exhaustion. Machines always break down. The true tragedy was the cold, detached boardroom calculation that the people running those machines were simply an inefficient variable that needed to be permanently eliminated. It stands as a stark, concrete reminder that in the modern architecture of global business, corporate loyalty flows in only one direction. A massive conglomerate will gladly spend $1 billion on marketing to convince the world it has a soul, all while systematically dismantling the very human communities that built its empire from the ground up. The heavy concrete walls are gone. The deafening roar of the assembly line has been permanently silenced, replaced by the quiet, sterile hum of a commercial retail plaza. But the ghosts of that industrial era remain beneath the asphalt, quietly asking us to consider what we have traded away for this new era of frictionless commerce. Thank you for watching. If this look into the forgotten human cost of the Cola Wars resonated with you, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on how modern corporations value their workforce today. Do you think the era of corporate loyalty is gone forever? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dive documentaries uncovering the rise, the ruins, and the reality of the industrial empires that shaped our modern world.